So we've heard a lot about risk-based assessments over the last 2 days, which has been really enlightening. This is actually going to be a bit more about the practical side and what we actually find when we get out there. And it's not always good. And Tony, I hate to tell you, but there are still people who have their procedures in their pockets. Tony put this definition up before. We take a risk-based approach to our pathology accreditation framework. We take a risk-based approach to our assessments, and the focus is on high-risk areas. So how do we actually achieve that? How is that focus achieved? So non-conformances, compliance with the standard is the way a lab protects itself from risk, as we've heard the last couple of days. Non-compliance helps the lab to identify areas where there is risk, helps the lab to identify areas of risk and where they need to improve and what they need to address. But it's the context around the non-compliance that we've been talking about a lot, and that becomes important in determining the risk profile. And so we actually perform a risk assessment on every non-conformance that we do. We introduced this a couple of years ago. It's a very simple 3x3 risk matrix. It got the conversation going. We've done no mathematical analysis around it, Tony, but it did get the conversation going with our technical, with the technical assessors as to what to look for. You know, is that piece of paper that's out of date? Is that really a risk, or is that something that we really, you know, do we even need to report it, or can we just say to them, this is something you need to address? But haematology, you know, the blood bank fridge and you receiving blood bank and doing something with it and transferring, that's a high risk. So that's sort of the context that we actually like to put around it. So as I said, each of our non-conformances gets a risk rating, and we just do very simple high, medium and low. As you heard also, the main non-conformances are training and competency, the introduction of new tests, QC, QAP and lab equipment. So the case studies are based on these common assessment findings. So the first one is about training and competency. So the lab has to ensure that training and competency records are available for all staff. It was noted when we went on this assessment, that the training records for a sample collector observed during the assessment, so you've been in an assessment, you've looked at someone, were not signed off and no competency assessment was available on the day. Without any more context, we don't actually know much more about this case. It's one person. Was it just something that they had done their competency? Had they just not been signed off? And did we need to actually look at it a bit better? And that's where the context part comes in. If it's just one person and they've not signed off, then this is a really low risk example and has low impact, and the risk rating that would be given was low. But if we start to build on this risk profile a little bit further, and we say the training and competency records for several new sample collectors were not complete. On the day of assessment, the collection supervisor stated that the staff were still supervised for most collection activities. So, you know, they're saying that they're supervised, but we'd have to dig a bit further. We'd have to go and have a look at maybe some areas that would need be reviewing, like the number of sample collection errors or the number of mislabeled specimens, and we'd have to dig a deep further. So we're getting some context around it, and if we find that it is just because these new ones they were busy and their records were not complete, then it's a medium risk. But if we actually dig further and we find that there's a high turnover of staff in specimen reception in the last 6 months, and the review of the records show that they were not complete and there was no ongoing competency. We'd also maybe see that the number of errors was increasing. We'd also see that, you know, what comes out in the internal audit when you go across the day, you've got issues in your specimen reception. We need to do something about this. This is a high risk area. We need to follow it up. So this is what I'm talking about when I mean we need to put context around our examples. And it comes down to the designated person. The training and competency The designated person who is a medical practitioner must have the appropriate qualifications and scope of practice. In this situation, when the scope of practice first became with the supervision document, when it first came out, scope of practice had to be demonstrated for a lot of pathologists, and this was high risk, and this is why we relied on the college a lot. We had some pathologists who were actually supervising, different disciplines, which has settled down now. We don't have that issue as much anymore, but we did have labs where the supervision wasn't adequate. And as a result, that's a very high risk because they're putting out results which they've not got the scope of practice to do. Verification. Verification is another one which is actually quite contentious at the moment, and at the AAC meeting recently it came up and we discussed the fact that how much verification is enough and how much is too much. And this is something that we're taking, and the individuals, the individual discipline representatives have agreed to take that on board to talk a bit more about what's required and what's not. So there's a new coag analyzer. It was signed off by the scientists, but it was not reviewed by the haematology supervising scientist for 6 months. And the pathologist and the QC manager hadn't looked at it for almost 2 years. It was done, the verification was fine, and the risk assessment hadn't been signed. So is it really going to affect things? No, because it was actually done, which is always a bonus. So it's a low impact. It just hadn't been signed off. Someone actually had a look at it, and there was sort of cooperation amongst the people who were working on the instrument. But a more medium risk one was a lab must perform further verification studies on the blood gas analyzer. There was no abnormal patients used to verify this one. And they didn't include above range pH or oxygen. So we're getting into a higher risk. So these results are going out, and there's been no check on them. No one's done anything. So, this is actually alarm bells are starting to go. And is it a once-off? Is there not any other equipment? Has every other piece of equipment been verified appropriately? You'd start to go, oh, I need to go and investigate this a little bit further, and start to and ask the questions. Whereas this one is a higher risk one. The Roche multiplate was reviewed, and there was a data, but the lab had to explain, which is required to expand the sample blood to include the full range of results for the intended use of the assay. So they'd done a little bit of verification, but they'd not actually done the whole range of results that they could possibly be getting. And they only use normal patients. Now, like I said, there is a bit of a debate as to what extent you need to go to around verification, because some people ask for a lot and some people ask for very little. So we're trying to actually get some consistency around that. But it does actually have potentially very high impact, because they've not actually tested that they can get the manufacturer's results. Validation. So recently, it's not so much now, but this was when the body fluids were used in the non-validated samples were used in the Backdating. So it was a different type of a body fluid, which had not been validated by the manufacturer. So it was up to so it becomes an in-house IVD, and it has to be fully validated by the laboratory. If it's not validated, it does actually have to be included. There has to be included notation on the report to say that it doesn't cover the performance of this test. So this was validation. It would probably have medium impact, because there's you'd get more context around it. Had they done any testing? Had they done anything? Why were they doing this testing? Was it just for research purposes within pathology, or was it to actually get results out? And you would actually determine that this was a medium impact result. So some quality QAP results, discordant results were neither identified nor any record taken. So this is just from one survey that there was no corrective action taken. So that would say, okay, just one survey, let me go and have a look at some other surveys to see that what happened. And if you actually came across other surveys where there'd been no response, you'd start to go, oh, there's something going wrong here, you're not doing your QAP properly. And if the lab's not doing the QAP properly, then there's potential issues. So, but this is just one survey from 2019. We'd probably start asking why, but you know, it does have potential to have high impact, but the frequency is low, so it was given a low risk rating. These are actually all taken from our database, so they are actually the practical examples. So the designated person, the designated supervising pathologist from the category GX or the GY lab must the category B lab operates must review and countersign QAP. There's evidence that the results have been signed off by the category B scientists, but no evidence of the records have been required by the GX staff. And this really reflects on the new supervision document, or when the supervision document came out, and the way labs are structured. The GX lab is, someone called it the mothership before, and the B labs, the supervision goes to those B labs. We are starting to see this more and more. Labs are starting to understand what we're talking about when we say the GX and the B lab. But we did recently have a lab where we were at a GX lab, and they wanted to see the supervision records for the B lab, one of the associated B labs, and the lab asked, why do you want to see that? What's that got to do with anything? And it's like, that's what the whole supervision is about. You're a unit, you're operating as a network, you need to actually demonstrate that you are actually you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing. So this was actually determined to be a medium risk because I think that the QAP was okay, but it just showed that there was no evidence that there's any supervision going out on the peripheral labs. Appropriate corrective actions must be recorded and delivered when external QC results that do not conform to accepted criteria. So this is actually I was going to say high, but it's only determined to be a medium risk, and that's actually also a bit subjective sometimes. So it's only samples 1 and 2 were outside of a range. A rerun was not recorded, and no further action could be presented on the day of assessment. And again, it would be context, and maybe they talked about it, and there would have been very few results that had gone out, or they felt that it wasn't actually a high-risk result. So this one is actually a high risk because the QAP performance in transfusion is probably one of the most fundamental things for a haematology laboratory, and it was suboptimal or unsatisfactory. And they have to review the next lot of transfusion results, and that was the solution, and referring again to the RNPS Appendix A. And then this is the last one of these, I think. I'm going to show. Blood fridges are still an absolute nightmare. So this one was where the blood units had actually been taken out of the fridge for more than 30 minutes. Had been issued to a patient but not been used, and then been returned to the fridge, so the indicator on it was actually red, and then it was subsequently given to somebody else. A review did show that only one incident had occurred in the last 3 months, which was good, but I think the risk rating for this one should obviously be very high. So that was followed up. So I'm going to give a case study now, just to show you a little bit more about some more actual incidences. The case study we've actually been building on a bit. I have sort of given some of this before, but we've actually built in more examples. This is a lab that you wouldn't want to be. This is probably one of our worst performing labs ever. So this is the report that you give that gets given to a lab when we finish an assessment. This was a GX lab where they chem, heme, immuno, and immunology and micro were represented. There were 2 category B labs in this lab. There were 3 technical assessors, and it was actually a reassessment. So we write all our non-conformances to both ISO and to NPAC. The only thing with NPAC that doesn't align is the use of the NATA logo. Obviously, that's not going to be something that's going to be, so other than that, everything is matched. So the first line is the ISO. Everything's given a code, a C, an M, or an observation. The risk rating is high, medium, low. We write to the NPAC, we only write to the NPAC standard. We don't write to the NPAC commentary. And this is actually significant within our database. We can now pull out anything within the NPAC commentary to tell you how many findings we have against how many findings against the standard. So this is a simple one to start with. The lab has to have a documented procedure for evaluating referral labs. And this particular, what's in there? Oh, skip. Which way am I going? That's just, there we go. So this lab referred out a lot of its testing to a referral lab, but didn't monitor it, and that was it. Referred it, and that was it, and didn't worry if the results were being followed up or anything. It was deemed to be a medium risk, and then when we see the rest of the lab, it was probably a higher risk, but at this stage it was deemed to be a medium risk. The next one was when non-conformances are identified, immediate action has to be taken to rectify them, and to the extent of the non-conformance determined, and examinations are halted and reports withheld as necessary. So within this, there were several instances where the QC results had failed, but nothing had actually happened and results were still being released. And there was no procedure detailing what action was actually required. And another non-conformance, and I've sort of bunched them together a bit, the audit schedule had not been expanded to include the managerial aspects. So the managerial aspects of a standard include internal audits, includes non-conformances, includes a management review, as opposed to the technical requirements, but they hadn't actually done anything in that audit schedule to actually address those issues. Labs have to prepare a risk management plan. When we first start, when the RCPA first came out and the supervision came out, nobody had really had risk management plans, and there wasn't much around, and they had to identify the key risks. But most labs have actually improved greatly over the last 18 months in terms of their risk management plan. And the labs have to perform, as we've heard Tony talk about before, labs have to monitor the performance of the service and modify processes to reduce and eliminate identified risk. But there was nothing happening that showed that they were doing that. Scope of practice. Supervising pathologist for immunology wasn't able to demonstrate scope of practice. So we're getting to some high risk stuff here. There was not sufficient staff with qualified training and competency to manage the lab, to do the testing with this appropriate scope of practice. And the company records has to be reviewed because there were a number that were incomplete. In view of the number of issues, we're getting a bit more serious here. In view of the number of issues that we've identified at assessment, the lab has to do competency for all staff and demonstrate it again for all staff. And there was no staff performance for the senior staff, which is actually one of the requirements of the supervision document. Verification, so a whole lot of new tests had actually been introduced and nothing had either been done, or they weren't signed off, or there was no comparison between the old and the new. It was, verification was a bit of a nightmare. So they didn't do any verification on the reticular sites. There was a new haematology analyzer added. There was no verification of the new micro kits. The correlations for the drug screen were only used QAP samples. The immunology verification was not signed as acceptable and was not performed till after they'd started testing, and that's actually quite common. We do find that when you go out there, people will actually start doing the testing and then do the verification, or then sign it off. Sometimes they get backdated, but we can't do anything about that. don't know what's happening here, George. Did I move that statement? Yeah, so that was the verification one. And, oh, I see. Okay, and then the QC material. They were using QC material that wasn't at relevant concentration. So how would they know that the test's actually working? So it has to be clinically relevant and within the boundaries of the test measuring. So in this case, the lower level QC for PSA and vitamin D was not at or near clinical decision value. The lab must perform a risk assessment to determine if the results are appropriate. The monitoring of the QC performance has to be improved. So there's a complete list of samples there of what they actually found. The problems was noted with the... How am I doing that? I'm not even touching anything. Right, I put it down, George. Is this not a touch screen? I'm just very clever. Okay, so we've done verification. The next thing we're going to look at was QC. So there was no long-term monitoring of QC for micro or haematology. So the picture's building, and by the looks on your faces, you're all in complete shock. But yes, it was an actual lab. The report was 56 pages. I've made some changes, obviously, to protect privacy, etc. But it did get pretty scary. Yes.
Why didn't you shut that?
Yeah, well,
it did. I got suspended.
Given that you've got a month.
Yeah, we've actually addressed that. That was actually something that came up at the ASC meeting last week or the week before that we are going to have to review that process, and we've agreed that I don't. There was the pathologist who was on site was actually fairly high, a well-known pathologist, and they did express concerns, but we worked with them and through them, and I think they stopped this testing. They stopped the relevant testing. But like I said, I've also ad-libbed a little bit to protect some privacy.
There's also potentially significant risks on historic results. So where's the duty of, follow-up?
I think that the time we went before, and this is going back quite a number of years. Oh God. The time we went before the lab was fine, and you do find that you go to a lab and you go the first time. Oh, is it that? Maybe that's what to do. You go the first time and okay. You go the first time and it's fine. They've got good staff, they've got good processes, and you can go back the next time. It just did it again, and I've not touched anything. And things have just completely fallen apart. Yeah. I don't know where we were at. Verification, QC, what was this? This one was the QC, this is the QAP one. Results weren't being submitted when they were due. And there are a number of examples of results not being submitted at all. And non-concordant results. So the full gamut, basically, that you would actually expect to see at a lab of this nature. The LIS was introduced and changed and updated, and it was not verified at the GX or the B laboratories, and that's another very high risk. So how do you know what results are you going out? Labs must have a process for clinical governance in place that ensures. So this was an overall arching one. Basically, it became like your clinical governance. George, I'm not touching anything. I'm magic. Their clinical governance was basically, and then I think the last one is the designated person. It was the designated person is responsible for all of this. You've got to do something about it. You've got to improve. You've got to actually, you've got to do a risk assessment, and you've got to look at the supervision, and you've got to enrol. You've got to make sure that it's enrolling. So all the things that Tony was emphasising before, this lab wasn't actually doing. And this is the lab that keeps on giving, because there was a few more things. It was the fridge and the freezer wasn't working. There was no relief arrangements. The collection staff weren't following appropriate procedures, and there was no inventory control. I'm not touching anything. So, can I go on to the next slide? So, I think that I'm going to talk about metrics a bit later, where we're actually starting to introduce. This is the non-conformance against the RCPA. Analytical is obviously the biggest one. That covers QC, QAP, does cover verification of equipment. It's quite all-encompassing, that thing. We're starting to get more of a breakdown of these figures, and I hope to be able to show you a few more later. Of our risk rating application, and we'll probably actually go back to review this and to see whether it's working. Over a 6-month review, 63% of our non-conformances were actually considered low risk. That lab I showed you that I did the case study for, absolutely exceptional, and you know, we did actually keep working with them, and we did work with them, and I think that they shut down that testing, and they've had a complete change of staff since, and I think they've had change of governance, they've had change of ownership even. Yes, but there are those labs out there. So the 63% of non-conformances were considered low risk, 30 medium risk, and 7% of ours are considered high risk. We are looking to actually build a risk profile. So in assigning these risks, we're actually looking to build organised. We are, one of our, what we're actually looking, this is probably a couple of year project, we're actually building a client risk profile. So we're looking, and that will include things like governance, risk management, the quality management system, the assessment experience or the assessment performance, whether your responsiveness, whether you're people there on the day or not, and the business continuity, which will look at things like staffing and whether how high the staff turnover is and what the support from management is. So we would actually, this will be internal at least initially. We build this client risk profile. So it might be a score out of 10. I don't know what it's going to be yet. We're sort of still in discussions about this. And we would like that to be able to use that to then say, well, you're one of our lower risk organisations. We don't want to come and see you as often, whereas the higher risk ones, like the lab that we shut down, we would actually come and see you more often. So we're just trying to build some models and some ideas and get some continuous improvement going. I'm starting. And that was I think next was thank you. Sorry. The accreditation criteria, what are they? Or I've actually renamed this one to why we do the things we do. So you've all been on an assessment, or most of you have been on an assessment. They all follow the same sort of pattern. There's a procedure that has to be followed. Why is that procedure followed? So what's the timing and the frequency of assessments? What determines the makeup of accreditation teams? How do we attempt to not kill each other? And it's all a bit of a juggling act. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. In putting this talk together, it really made me start to think about risk and governance has been running through the whole of today, and this is sort of, for me, a diagrammatic representation to show how it all fits together. So it's a big picture type situation. And ultimately how that will lead to better outcomes. I think that there is evidence that there is effective governance and risk management in place now, and each of these organisations will, like NPAC, will have its own governance as well. So I think that it's all interconnected, and I think that we're doing all right. I think that our labs can be assured that we do have effective governance in place. And that this will complement their own procedures or whatever they're actually doing. So I'm going to look at each one, and of course I'm going to look for NATA, the first one, because it's the easiest one for me, and just to talk about what's in place. So, as Andy spoke about yesterday, NATA is a signatory to ILAC, which is the International Accreditation Corporation, and to APAC, which is the regional version. Accredited ones accepted everywhere. and he spoke about wine yesterday. I wonder why, and how exports, and it saves Australia an awful lot of money. There's 90 countries which are signed up to ILAC, which includes France, Germany, Japan, and America. Our 4,500 accredited facilities can actually harness that energy or harness that. And so it's a real benefit to Australia, and it's not something we'd actually really want to lose. To be a signatory, you have a signatory accreditation body, you actually have to act in accordance with the auditing standard 17011, which I think Andy briefly touched on yesterday. So this is the auditing standard, and it's got a very convoluted name, conformity assessment requirements for accreditation bodies, accrediting conformity assessment bodies. So our labs are called conformity assessment bodies. You may hear people call them CABs, and they're trying to bring that in a bit more, and that's actually what it actually means. So just some of the summaries that's in the standard. It talks about the accreditation symbols. You can't just, and that talks about ILAC, it talks about NATA and who can and can't use those symbols. It talks about impartiality of all parties, and that's where the conflict of interest comes from. I mean, we have to protect privacy anyway, but we have to ensure that every assessment we go on, that the technical assessors have actually signed a conflict of interest, and this is where this inference is coming from. All staff performing assessments have to be trained and competent, and that's possibly why we're here. Well, that's why I'm here today, and our NATA staff go through a lot of training and competency. There's always some ongoing stuff. It talks about the process of applying for accreditation, that basically if you're applying for accreditation, you have to address that you've addressed the standard that you're applying to be accredited under before we'll even commence talking to you. And that's, this is all regulated from the standard. The assessment, you have to have a preparation process. You've got to review all the documentation before we come out. And this is all stated within the standard. The assessment process talks about the opening meeting. And you have to state, each of your opening meetings should actually state the purpose of assessment. So that's why when every assessment we go on, there's always an opening meeting, and it should say the objective. And that's sort of the one line that we've actually drilled into people. You have to say why you're there. There has to be closing meetings. There have to be provisions report at the end of the day. Accreditation cycles have to be less than 5 years. The human pathology one is actually 4 years. And 3 years, and there's a reason why it varies a little bit within human pathology, but that comes down to the deed a bit later. And there's details on how to suspend or withdraw an accreditation. So when things happen, we actually are complying with the standard that we have to comply with, that we're about to be audited on ourselves. 17011 also talks about cause analysis, and that's actually where the cause analysis originally came from. Karen spoke about this yesterday. The primary focus of cause analysis is fixing the system and not the symptoms. And when you have a response, you have to put in the cause analysis each time. When cause analysis first came out, and this document was rewritten in 2017, 18, I think it came out again, and we started you had to give us a cause analysis. People would just rewrite the deficiency, and that was their cause analysis. Or human error. It was always human error, and I don't know how many times we got human error. human error. We stopped accepting human error, and we don't accept the rewording and deficiency. So this was again a cultural shift. It was a slow process. It took about 12 months. The labs have to show that they've actually made an effort to establish what the root cause analysis was, or what the cause analysis was. As Karen spoke about yesterday, the strongest recommendation would always be the preferred option. If it's a repeat deficiency, then the lab should go back to the cause analysis. So if we come out next time and the same thing has happened, you would have to say, well, this happened last time, it's happened again. You need to go back to your cause analysis and have another look. It's a very powerful tool to reducing risk. And in the long run, it will save resources, time and money for a laboratory. So the standards that NATA actually accredits against is 17025, so that's all the testing labs other than human pathology. Conformity assessors inspection, they test things like playgrounds and I can't remember what some other interesting things an inspection does. My favourite, of course, is biotechnology, the BioBanking standard. This is a new standard that came out just a couple of years ago, and we've got one lab, BioBanking Victoria, is accredited to the BioBanking standard. It follows the same structure as all the others, and it's if anyone wants to know about it, biobanking has become an absolutely fascinating thing for me. And of course, there's 15189, the requirements for medical laboratories. This is the scope of 15189. There's the scope, there's the management requirements, and there's the technical requirements. So there's the three headings, and you're all familiar with them. The management requirements includes things about auditing, includes things about non-conformances, management review, and the technical requirements is training and competency and validation and verification and procedures. However, the document has actually just been updated, and it is about to be, by the end of the year, it'll be ratified, basically. And the new FDIS, it's actually what it's called at the moment, will come out by the end of the year, and we will start assessing to it, I would have thought before the 30th of June next year. There will be a transition time. We will have a transition policy. We will start to offer training in it. Our training services people have already put together a training program for it. So there's a very much big focus on governance and risk and focus on patient safety. So just be warned. It's come in line with the rest of the ISO documents. It reflects the ISO 9000, so it's a sort of a standardisation, and it was it's going to be a bit of work next year. So there'll be a 3-year transition policy. So your lab will be transferred over to this new document within 3 years. Usually, hopefully, they'll give us that transition. There was a lot of talk yesterday about the AAC. We do rely on the AAC, who was appointed by our board. I thought this was actually really important to put up, just so that you know this is our governance, this is NATA's governance. We don't make technical decisions, and if anyone asks us for an interpretation or if there's issues, the questions go to the AAC, and we get their governance, we get their control over or their input into any potential issues. We also have on our at our AACs, we have a member from IANZ. So in New Zealand, the equivalent to the equivalent to NATA is IANZ. And they come and give a report each year. It was very interesting to hear their report this year because they talked a lot about COVID. They don't have a TGA equivalent in New Zealand. They had a lot of troubles with COVID testing and people going a bit rogue and introducing the testing that wasn't about 50% of their tests that they were doing over there. It was a big issue. They've also got a lot of workforce shortages. I think they've got one genetic pathologist. New Zealand is struggling a little bit with the workforce. No talk would be complete without talking about scopes, which are always the bane of everybody's life. So NATA underwent a digital transformation. Our scopes are now itemised. A lot of work, blood, sweat and tears has gone into them. And we can now, on the website, we only go down to the determination section. I've just got to get that right. So people can't actually see your scopes beyond the determination yet. So they can't see what technique you use or what procedure you use, but we can. And this allows us to be really responsive. During COVID, we were able to determine the number of labs that were accredited to the COVID testing. Recently, there was a big scare with Legionella. The 5 people died in Brazil and they thought it was a COVID test, but it was Legionella, and we had to go and see how many labs were doing Legionella testing. And we were very prepared for that because everyone's got to be prepared for the next pandemic. And we found out that, so we could extract that information really easily. What we did find is that in fact, all labs in Australia are using the same kit. So they're all on the same platform. So this is actually another risk that we've identified, that we brought up with the Department of Health, that maybe the standardisation of platforms is going to actually potentially, and we did see that with COVID in terms of getting supplies in and what we were going to do. There is a addition to scope process, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on, but there is procedures that you have to go through. So we can it's allowed us to be a lot more responsive. We would before now our scopes were not really very detailed. And labs could basically change their testing between visits and we would know nothing about it. And, you know, they'd introduce all this testing. So there's rules around introducing testing and there's rules around not being accredited to certain things. Just a couple of other miscellaneous things. Technical assessors, there are lots of usage restrictions around technical assessors. That's why we want more. So privates don't take privates and some publics don't take privates and as Andy talked about, states don't take each other. We don't want to use you too often. Travel restrictions with COVID have actually been really, really limiting. So, yeah, our staff do pull their hair out and you almost hear them ring a bell or something when they've got a technical assessor. It's so good. And you could end up in your poon, so, you know, or is it you? Did anyone listen to the news last night? Your pee or your poon? So there's lots of actual travel involved. Most technical assessors have usually come back and have had a good time. We are always after technical assessors for novel testing, for new testing. And we actually rely on the college a little bit to help us with this when new testing comes in. So there was one for a risk score that a lab was actually putting in for polygenic risk scores. So we came to the college, that was a couple of years ago, came to the college to ask them about, you know, who would be appropriate to do this. So any novel testing that comes out is actually always a challenge for us to find appropriate assessors. If we have to go overseas, we do, but usually we can meet most of the requirements within Australia, but not always. There's also the NATA rules, which talk about the use of emblems. I think we're a bit fixated on that, and the role of the authorised rep. And then the job types. The job types that you'd always be asked to look at are reassessments, and they're usually on site. And they're a day's assessment for usually a day. Sometimes they can be more. You'd be asked to look for a variation visit. A variation visit is when people want to add something to the scope. And that's usually on site. It's usually we're adding it as a variation visit because the lab has had no expertise in that field before. It's new or novel testing, and that's why we need to go on site. As opposed to a DTV, which is a desktop review, which you may be asked to do. Someone will have to bring you up and ask you to do a desktop review. Desktop review is all paperwork, basically. You'll be asked to do that if the lab actually has the expertise. It's not a new scope line that they're adding, but it's not a new service line that they're adding. They are just expanding what they do, and that's really just a simple look at the paperwork and sign that off. There is another application document called the SAD, which talks about interpretive comments. This is not something you really need to memorise, but just if you're out on an assessment and you're asking about maybe whether this point of care, they've got 10 point of cares and they're not all enrolled in QAP, or, you know, the verification wasn't enough, or the lab's doing drug testing, what are the requirements around drug testing, you may have a comment. There's the connection to the actual document, but it would be up to the NATA staff to actually tell you that, and they would actually say, oh, well, the blood gas analyzers, these are cartridge-based, so they don't have to have as much QAP or QC, sorry, and you could work through it that way. So it's not, you don't have to memorise that. You can get a copy of it and have a read of it. It's more to provide guidance as to how we interpret some of the documents. I would actually just like to point out that a network is more than one lab operating under the same governance system. So when we actually talk about labs now, and as part of the revised assessment model that we came up with, we are talking about networks, and networks all come under the one governance system. So you just need to be aware of that. So our revised assessment model, which came into effect in 2021, it's going to be changed. Its name's going to change to the multi-site assessment model. Level one is the organisation reviews. That would be New South Wales Health Pathology, because they're considered one network. Sonic Pathology is one network. And so we actually have an organisation review. We have one meeting every 4 years, just to talk about how these labs communicate with each other. Is there, because sometimes things are centralised, like IT might be centralised for these organisations. It's just to see that whether you're communicating with each other, how you're approaching risk, if you're all consistent across your organisation. This is actually, these visits, we've only done one, we've done one, and we're having a halfway visit, which we're going to start talking to people about what they want to produce. They're usually done by, pretty experienced technical assessors. And it's a Zoom or a Teams meeting, and it's just to discuss the coordination between it. The next visit that got introduced with this new assessment model was the designated person, and we've heard a little bit about it, the governance assessment. So what we originally did was that the designated person would with again an experienced technical assessor, would ask questions to the designated person about how they know what's going on in an organisation. If something happens out in your B lab, how does that information come back to you? How are you ensuring that every single test is actually supervised? So this is the designated person. Originally what we did also was we brought in each of the disciplines and to talk to them about what sort of interactions they have with the designated person and how they communicate. We didn't feel that we got much value out of that, so the designated person is changed. This is sort of a changing visit, this one, but it is actually having value because it is actually bringing in the designated person, and they have to demonstrate that they have actually responsibility and that they are actively monitoring that and actively undertaking it. Then we have the discipline-specific assessments. These are once every 4 years. If there is no on-site, if there's an on-site pathologist that does the supervision in a GX or GY, you will get a visit. If there's no on-site pathologist and the supervision is coming from a different lab, it's not. That's a branch sampling exercise. It was originally going to be sampling because we wanted to not actually go on site to all labs, but as you'll see in a minute, the deed says we have to. So we've actually modified that and we do what's called an ARE. So if we go to a B lab now, we're doing a sampling. We may just sample haematology one stage, and then the NATA person will do a chemical pathology. We did a lot of work around what non-conformances were identified. We did a lot of work around what testing was done at these labs, and remarkably, for all of the networks, the testing at the B labs was pretty much consistent across the board. So, if there's no direct supervision, then it's a sampling exercise. But when we're actually doing the level 3, the discipline, we also want to look at, and we want you to look at what's happening out in those B labs, and are they monitoring what's happening in the B labs? And we've actually put a supplementary guide together for you to just have a look at. Is there communication? Is there, if there's incidences, are they being reported back? How is that happening? Because this is a hub and spoke system. This is the beauty of the supervision document and how it came out. It's the way pathology is structured in Australia. So let's harness that. Let's, if you want to be considered to be the one network, then let's get those economies of scale and look at them really carefully. So that's the revised assessment model. We've had some really good feedback about the governance parts and that we're focusing on the risk. We now have the ability to, when you go on an assessment, we have the ability to give you every non-conformance for the whole of the network over the last 12 months or 18 months. I don't know if staff are giving you that, but you could actually have a look at it. We have the ability to do that. So that sort of hones us in, and you can actually sort it also by what B lab had it and what didn't have it. So we're improving in our communication because we had to put the tools around it as well. And so they're the tools that we've got going there. And just one more thing about pathology. Might push the right button. We are actually working very hard. We're working to build some data sets for you, some metrics. So and I've got a few stats coming up in a minute. It's all about the data, so data improvement. So we were actually looking. What we're aiming to do is annually have an industry finding report, which basically shows what's happening across the industry. And then the next step down from that is we'd like to be able to benchmark you against that industry. this is the stage 3 of the AIMS system, or the computer system database that we put in. It's now been populated enough. We're hoping to actually build on this profile so that you can basically benchmark yourself against everybody else and where it's going. And this is also builds into the risk profile I was talking about before that we hope to build. So this is our continuous improvement activity, and it's all about the data, of course. And then we can drilling down will actually help you. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the College of Pathologists, which I think you're all pretty familiar with. So it is the 40th, a terrible slide, I know, but it is the 40th year. 40 years ago was the Challenger disaster. It was Chernobyl. Margaret Thatcher was still the Prime Minister of England. Lady Gaga was born. And the first 3D printer. So I think it's really important to reflect how far this relationship has come as well. And it's a really good collaboration. During that time, we were not only strong during the pandemic, but there was no molecular testing at all. The first NGS lab, it was in 2003, and the whole genome was in 2016. So it was only 6 years ago, and you just see how far we've come since then. We've also seen the introduction of new limb systems, and now we've got SMS, we've got digital microscopy. So it's been a really good relationship in those 40 years. A few ups and downs, but the relationship has actually been really good, and I think it will actually stand the test of time, because there's what's things on the horizon, AI and machine learning, which we're seeing being introduced. So where will that go? Just in terms of technical assessors, we have NATA and the RCPA have an MOU, and the MOU determines what technical assessors have to go where. So we're practical. You have to take a pathologist to every GX or GY lab. If we don't, we have to actually, pretty much what we do, and we did have a few cases where we couldn't, we have to bring the reports back and send the reports to a pathologist and make sure that we've covered things off. But, that would be after days of trying to find a pathologist. We take, now this was updated, hot off the press yesterday, and I didn't get the new copy. I don't think it has changed that much. We do actually, where practical, take a pathologist to a Category B lab. And that's not always easy when the Category B lab is 3 days travel away or 2 days travel away, and it's precious time, unless there's a sound assessment history. So this is why we need lots of pathologists to actually join our accreditation, because we only want to take you once or twice a year. We probably take to Category B, we probably take about 40% of the time, and that's becoming less and less in the last 6 months, I'd say, because it's getting harder and harder. The clinical governance assessments as well, we seek assistance with those. Like I said, they're usually the most experienced pathologists that we do take to those assessments. Our other interactions with the RCPA under the MOU, any poorly performing labs are reviewed before sending to the before we send a report to the lab, it goes to the AAC. So if you're out there and you're doing an assessment and you think this is a terrible lab, the decision is you're not on your own. There are governance arrangements in place with us. We will send that report to the AAC, and it's usually Peter gets it because there's the chair of the AAC, and Damon usually gets it, and whoever, if it's discipline specific, then that person will get it too, and so they're aware of what's going on. And when new accreditations also have to go to the AAC, and everything gets reviewed by 2 members. So this is like your protection, it's governance, and to assure you that we're doing right. The RCPA, the registrar training, so when you go out and do assessments, you are required to, if there's registrars on site, you have an interview with them, a chat with them, as Peter talked about yesterday, which is really important. When the new supervision document came out, excuse me, and there was a lot about pathologists requiring scope of practice and credentialing. The college actually helped a lot with that. It's not so much now that's settled down, but if there is a pathologist out there who has issues with their scope of practice and wants to demonstrate that they do have appropriate scope of practice, then that's actually something that we rely very heavily on the college for. And like I said, we actually we go to them for a lot of guidance, particularly around the introduction of new testing and industry development. So one of the latest industry developments is that we're having some labs who are doing a lot of their molecular testing overseas, which is actually, you know, how far does our accreditation come in, and we're reporting here. So that's sort of a question. And then wellness testing, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is beginning to pose a real problem. There's more and more labs who are doing wellness testing, and what are they accredited for, and how effective is it? So that's one of the issues there. The next one is that we actually interact with is NPAC. As you're aware, we've talked about the principles. To receive Medicare reimbursement, you have to be accredited to the NPAC documents. That says that's dictated in the principles. We don't offer a two-tiered system, basically. If you're not going to have it Medicare, you still have to comply with most of the NPAC documents. The supervision document, not so much the details about the pathologist on site, but still you do have to comply with the appendix at the back, because that talks about risk. And you still need to have, because you still have to comply with the RMPS, which talks about having a requirement to have a medical practitioner. So even though you're not going for Medicare, we do still say that to be accredited, you have to have basically almost everything but the pathologist on site. So that's actually, you know, that's again something that's caused a bit of friction, but most labs do actually comply because they want to get the accreditation that aren't going to go for, aren't going to have Medicare. So you probably, this is an old slide actually, but all labs are assessed to Tier 2, Tier 3A and 3B documents. So every lab you go to will have all of those documents, the IT document, the QAP document, the transport document, the measurement of uncertainty document. It will all be those. And then the next ones are discipline specific. Yes, so it's actually really important to note that they are, or you don't actually have to have the documents with you. The lead assessor, for NATA lead assessor, is usually quite aware of what, you know, some of the requirements or most of the requirements, and they can always pull them up. Thank goodness for digital technology, because the folders used to be really big. Just some stats for you, and I think I'm going to steal Peter Stewart's thunder. This is the industry summary that we put together. Of the 282 assessments we did in 2021, these are res. We did a lot of other assessments too. Most labs, 41% of labs had no findings against the RMPS, and those labs that did have it, the average was 7, or the median was 4. So that's actually pretty good that you know, 51% of labs had no findings against the RMPS. And there is actually the ISO and NPAC documents, they're matched. Like I said, the only one thing that really isn't matched is the NATA logo. So we actually try and be consistent in what we do. For the supervision document, 89% of labs complied. So that's actually something that's a significant value. The average number would be 2 against that. Oh, sorry. The most common finding against the RMPS was actually S7B.5, which off the top of my head is equipment. And the second highest finding against the RMPS is staff training and competency. So again, that reflects what I said in the previous talk. Under supervision was the findings around the designated person and risk assessments. And when we first, in 2021, of course, these documents, you know, risk assessments were relatively new, and there were issues around them. So under the quality, external quality assessment document, 77% of labs had no findings, and the ones that did, every lab has to have a documented QC process and enrolment in QAP programs. They were the two major things that we would find against those. So there's just some interesting figures that have started to come out of the data that we're getting. Just in terms of the Tier 4 NPAC documents, requirements for transfusion lab practices with, so there were 46 labs of the 228, 46 were actually assessed against the transfusion document because they do transfusion, and 63% of those had no non-conformances. The main finding was blood fridges, cold chain storage. People just putting things back into, receiving blood back into supply. The second highest thing for anatomical pathology cut-up, and we're getting down to some pretty small numbers here, so they all mean the same. So 88% of the labs had no non-conformances, and for the human genome, only 13 labs were actually assessed against that, and most of them were actually had no non-conformances. One more thing about NPAC, which is very topical at the moment. So on the 1st of August, the new version of the IT document became effective. And it does actually talk about data breaches, cyber risks, information security management systems, electronic communication security. So there's a real IT focus. This document, we've had to get a whole new set of technical assessors who understand a different language from me, and we're next Monday actually is our first assessment against it. What we plan to do is that each site will be assessed over a 4-year period, and we will generate some reports on that. We've already had some feedback about where the IT document starts and where it finishes, so that's going to be really interesting, but we've got to get out there and find out what we've done. So we've trained all the technical assessors appropriately. We ran a course for the technical assessors just to talk to them about it. We'll run another one in February when we've done a couple of assessments and we can start to talk about it a bit more. The first one that we had organised got cancelled, which was a bit of a bummer, but hopefully we can move on. Okay, so the next group of people that we interact with, or the part of the government, is the Commission, and we heard Margaret talk about the Commission yesterday. Our interaction to date has actually been quite limited with the Commission. We basically put a white paper together to talk about our accreditation process. There's been a lot of requests for data and metrics on visits, which has been fine, only that their database is set up differently from our database, and you know how databases like to talk to each other. We are very aware of the privacy requirements here, and if we feel that we have to, that we may divulge information that we shouldn't, we will be coming to labs to say that this is the information that has been requested. So we'll let you know, but at the moment it's all pretty general, high-level stuff. We're watching with interest when they talked about the requirement for the retirement of standards. How is that going to work? Because there are people out there, and we saw in my last presentation, who will say, I don't need to do this anymore, so why do I have to do it? But there are a lot of impact standards, so it will be good to see some move on that. So we're watching with interest. And there is, I'm about to talk about the deed, there is a potential to include the deed in the Commission, but like I said, your lab's privacy is something that we're very aware of. The next one is Services Australia and the Department of Health. So we have a deed of agreement between the Department of Health and between the Commonwealth of Australia and the Department of Health, and the Department of Health is represented by Services Australia and the Department of Health. And the day we signed that off, Services Australia changed their name to, I think they're Services Australia and Health and Ageing or something. I don't know what they're called. So they just keep changing their name. So it's a tripartite deed, and it sets out the our roles and responsibilities. So it was a year-long negotiation to get this deed underway. The previous deeds, we've had deeds with Services Australia for a long time. The previous deed was only with Services Australia, but the Department of Health have now actually joined the deed. So the deed talks about I'm just taking some highlights of it, that we will report to the Minister as requested from time to time, and we have actually had questions from, in the previous government, we had a couple of questions about, laboratories, and they wanted some direct information, and we try and de-identify again, but, the deed, there's a governance committee which meets twice a year, I think it is, and there's also a working group which meets quarterly. We have to report on any emerging issues and any notifiable events. The emerging issues that we've actually spoken to them about last time was the workforce shortages, particularly in B labs. We're finding a lot of our country labs, there's just not the staff, scientific, and even the pathologists aren't out there anymore. They don't, there's a real shortage, and how that's going to affect service, and also we also talked about the standardisation of platforms, and have we opened ourselves up to potential risks. They require the deed talks about the provision of the Medicare report, the report on lab premises it's actually called, and I think I've actually written that down twice, I've just noticed. The deed requires us to do an on-site, on-site we've actually debated with them, but we lost. So we have to do an on-site assessment at least once every 3 years, which is why we have to go to some of these point-of-care labs, which are claiming Medicare in the middle of South Australia. Lovely drive around South Australia. I don't know if any of you have ever done the drive. I loved it. But, to go and visit a point-of-care lab for half an hour is waste of resources, waste of environment, waste of everything. But we have to go and visit the labs once every 3 years. We have to provide them with a report on lab premises. When labs relocate, there's processes around what you have to do, and there's, of course, confidentiality and privacy obligations. So it's the deed that dictates a lot of the NATA processes and where we have to move from. This is an extract of the copy of the Medicare report. This is the Medicare report that basically all labs want from us. They want the Medicare report, they want it in time so they can give it to Services Australia. If you notice that this report has not changed for about, I'd say nearly 20 years now, I suppose. It still has the lab categories, GX, GYB. There's no B point of care, there's no SB. The Medicare system doesn't have the capacity to cope with that. So basically we're the only ones who know how many point of care labs are out there because the infrastructure hasn't been maintained. And these are the P groups that they talk about, and they talk about them quite consistently. We have to actually tick that the lab participates in QAP, that there's staffing, equipment, and any exceptions. Now, the exceptions have dropped off because it used to be, I'm in this P group, but I'm only doing this test. And the Medicare system couldn't quite cope with that, so that got even more complicated, so now we don't do exceptions. This is, like I said, this is not our document, this is Medicare's or Services Australia's document. When we give out a new document, you get your Medicare for an extra 3 years, so we have to extend it for 3 years. And I think that's about all I have to say on the Medicare report. It's very precious. The TGA is another group that we actually have an MOU with. And the TGA's remit is to protect public health, ensuring that all properly manufactured and sand validated in our IVDs are used in labs. So we have the MOU. The framework became effective in 2017. The IVDs are based on level of risk, as you're probably aware. Most of them are class 1 to 3. Class 4 we don't really have anything to do with. That would be things like Ebola testing or some HIV testing, and they're the high risk ones, and the TGA do it directly with them. So yeah, we're able to do class 1 to 3. Labs have to submit their IVD data annually to the TGA, and they basically use the NATA scope of accreditation. So that's why we have an extra column, which isn't displayed on the website, but you will see the class. It shows the class of IVD, and they use that directly from us. So with the TGA, new IVDs are assessed against, states has to be assessed against 15189, and the impact requirements for the development of in vitro diagnostic testing, clinical utility and validity, which come up in that document, are really vital for some of these tests. I mean, this is some of the tests, like the wellness test, can they display clinical utility and validity? So they're actually quite hot topics. And how do they actually display it? And there are limited cases where labs can be assessed under the TGA to 17025, and these are usually like Hendra virus. I think the lab down in Geelong has an accreditation to Hendra, but it's under 17025 because they're actually testing horses, but it can actually have implications. Just one other thing that I think you should be aware of. All commercially supplied diagnostic tests must be listed on the ARTG. However, if you're not claiming anywhere in Medicare, anyone can do that testing, anywhere. So that's a bit of a loophole, and actually has caused us quite some concern along the way. So as long as it's on the ARTG, it can be imported into Australia and anyone can do the testing. Moving on, we have the state, I'm nearly finished. Moving on, we have the state health departments. We actually have MOUs with most of the state governments. We hold regular meetings with them, at least annually, to talk about, the changing landscape, what's happening in the health departments. We have to notify them of any issues. And during COVID, we actually interacted, particularly with the Victoria and New South Wales Health Pathology, because the COVID tests, they wanted to move them to saliva testing, and there was no protocols around them. The protocols for the hotel quarantine testing in Victoria, and in fact went across all states. They worked pretty heavily with us as to how they were going to get these onto scope, how they were going to get accreditation for them. So it was really good to have established these relationships already and be able to talk to them about what was required and what was going on. And last but not least is our lab stakeholders. Our stakeholders, we do have to manage their expectations. We have to make sure that their governance structures don't get in the way of appropriate of the process. We have to protect their privacy. This is something that we won't send out documents as to who's doing what, or you will have actually gone through the request to be a technical assessor, and you'll get asked certain ways, and we won't tell you who you actually ask, who you're going to assess until afterwards. And this is all to protect people's privacy. We have to ensure that we do take a consistent approach, and we continuously improve things within our organisation to show that we are having a consistent approach. We have to have continuous improvement, and we just got to remain relevant. Quality can just become quality for the sake of quality, and I think that we want to continue to grow it and want to. I think the whole conversations about risk. We wouldn't have been having these 5 years ago. So I think that's how we remain relevant. So NATA, we test the testers. So that's what it's all about. So all in all, I think that we are showing effective governance and risk. And I'm going to get the marketing people or the picture gurus to tart this up a bit and make it look and extend it a bit more. And that's why we do some of the things we do. So I hope that sort of gives you a bit of an outline and sort of explains that, we don't actually do some of these things that we do on an assessment for the sake of it. There is reasons behind it. We're complying with our regulations, we're complying with our governance, and I think that's what provides quality about it. So thank you.